All right, welcome back to the third talk for today. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Katie Dagon, who's the project scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, working in the Climate and Global Dynamics Laboratory. She uses machine learning approaches to understanding sources of uncertainty in climate models, and will present today on how to emulate land surface processes using machine learning. Thank you, Katie. Over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Karthik. Hope the screen looks okay. Just let me know. Yeah, I want to talk today, kind of do a deep dive into a particular way that I've used machine learning in my research. And that's to think about how we can emulate climate models, and more specifically a land surface model, in order to do some uncertainty quantification. And sort of based on, the talks that we've seen so far this week, some of the fundamentals and some of the questions that I've been seeing come up, I'm going to try to be really specific about my process and how I went about this work. And this was the first time I did any machine learning type research. So hopefully it'll be helpful for you all to see an example of how I went about this and my process. And the other thing that I should say is that I'm a climate scientist. I'm not a machine learning specialist. So I was sort of learning about how to use these tools as I went along. And so hopefully that'll be helpful to all of you out there. So to start, I want to really motivate the question that I was thinking about for this work, which is to better understand uncertainty in the predictions of climate models. In particular, I was focusing on land surface models. So I'm showing here a figure comparing several different models. Each line on this plot is a different climate model, all run with the same climate foreseen conditions, RCP 8.5 scenario out to 2100. And what's plotted on the y-axis is the annual flux of carbon from the land. And so what you can see is that all of the models show quite a large spread in the prediction of this flux by the end of the century, such that the land could either be a carbon sink, so the positive values, or a carbon source by the end of the century. And this has really broad, important consequences for the global carbon cycle. And one of the reasons, studies have shown, sort of understanding this spread, is that there's uncertainty inherent in the structure, and in particular in the parameters that go into these land surface models. And so there's some references here if you're interested in reading more about that. So I wanted to really explore this question a bit more, and in particular, I am going to use one land surface model, the community land model, or CLM, and that is the land surface component of the community Earth system model that we use at NCAR. I should say that these models are very complex, as you can probably tell from this overview schematic. They are trying to include a lot of processes, especially when they're run globally. And so inherent in that is that they've got to parameterize a lot of these processes, and they've got to sort of choose different parameter values for the equations that are used to model these processes. And the uncertainty in those parameter choices is really what I wanted to explore with machine learning. And just to sort of give you a really concrete example of what I mean by uncertainty in land model parameters, I'll talk just briefly about a particular model parameter that has to do with stomatal conductance, which is sort of the trade-off between water and carbon in a plant. And it has to do with these particular processes, transpiration and photosynthesis, I've highlighted here. So as an example of parameter uncertainty, we have this process of stomatal conductance. And basically what it is the amount of opening on the stomata, on the surface of the leaves. And this is important because the leaves need to take up carbon in order to photosynthesize, but they also lose water at the same time. So modeling this process is really important, and it has a lot of implications for carbon and water cycling. And the data that I'm showing here is kind of plotting the relationship between stomatal conductance and photosynthesis. And we can extract from this data for a particular plant type a relationship between this process. And so the slope of this line ends up being a really important model parameter. And I'm just showing you here how this parameter is used in the land surface model. It's built into the equations of modeling stomatal conductance and photosynthesis. But there's some uncertainty on this parameter, and a lot of that has to do with just trying to account for lots of different observations and different plant types. So we need to sort of account for that uncertainty when we're running our simulations. And so that's just one example of how parameter uncertainty propagates through to produce different predictions with the land surface model. So my sort of question was, can we use machine learning to think about this parameter uncertainty? And so on the right here, I'm showing a figure from Rosie Fisher trying to document how parameter calibration, when you're doing it by hand, is often like a game of whack-a-mole. You fix something in one part of the model and then it breaks something else. And so this process of hand tuning parameter values can take a long time. It can take a lot of human time and a lot of computer time, lots of trial and error. So my question was, can we use machine learning to help streamline this process? Can we use it to make this process more efficient? So just to give an overview of how I'm going to be using machine learning for this work is really to build an emulator for the land surface model. And so I'm outlining here the sort of flow of the input and output that I'll be using to train this emulator. The input are the parameter values that I talked about on the previous slides. So those particular parameterizations that go into modeling the land surface processes. And then I'll be training a neural network based emulator to predict the output of the land model. And really the reason we're doing this is to save that computer time, to have that higher computational efficiency, because once we train this simpler model, it's a lot faster to run and to test out different parameter combinations than it would be to run the full model itself. So that's really the main reason that we want to use machine learning in this context. And then I'll just briefly note that this isn't the first time that climate models have been emulated using neural networks. So a couple of examples from the literature of how climate models have been emulated with neural networks. On the left here is showing an example of a comparison between climate model and a neural network for the change in global average surface temperature with some uncertainty. So you can see sort of how that's performing over time. And then on the right here, paper from one of my co-authors, Ben Sanderson, looking at emulating climate sensitivity. And so I'll also show plots similar to this, where he's sort of looking at the performance of the emulator by plotting the predictions of climate sensitivity on the y-axis and the actual climate sensitivity on the x-axis. And so this is a nice way of sort of testing the predictive skill of the emulator. I should also say that this is an example of supervised learning. So we learned a little bit about those terms earlier this week. Because we know the answer, we're going to have some ground truth from the climate model to allow us to train this emulator. So I want to just go through a brief roadmap for this talk and for how I'm using machine learning for this project. So first step, of course, is to train. So training a series of neural networks to predict land model output given the parameter values as input. The next step is then to use those trained neural networks as emulators to make predictions, again with much increased computational efficiency. The third step is actually to start bringing in observations and to try and do the parameter calibration. So minimize the error in the predictions of the emulator relative to those observations in order to generate so-called optimal or best fit parameter values and distributions. And then the fourth step is really to test those optimal parameter values and distributions and to really think about how changes, how this uncertainty sort of changes model predictive skill. Can we get a more constrained prediction for the future? And the other thing I'll say is that I'm going to go through steps 1 and 2, and then I'll pause for questions. Hopefully that'll be about halfway or 2/3 of the way through the talk, so we can have a a pause for questions here, and then we'll continue. So coming back to this schematic, similar to what I showed earlier, just to really emphasize the training process here. So again, we're starting with our input as parameter values, and we're training a neural network emulator to predict the output of the land surface model. But because this is supervised learning, we're using known output values. And I'm going to talk about how I generated the training data for that based on an ensemble of model simulations. And then the other thing I'll note is that this is an example of a regression problem, since we're predicting a quantitative output. And that's a little bit different than some of the classification examples that we've seen so far. So hopefully it'll be helpful to see a more in-depth example of a regression problem. I won't get to talk about this too much, but there's 6 different parameter values that I'm using as my inputs, and they mostly focus on biophysical processes. And those 6 were selected because they were very sensitive, and that was based on a series of sensitivity tests. That's a whole other talk, so I don't really have time to talk about that today, but I'm happy to talk about more with folks. So generating the training data. So that's kind of, step 0 is generating the training data. And the way that I did this was to initially run the land surface model in a perturbed physics or perturbed parameter ensemble framework. So I used 100 different parameter combinations that were generated with Latin hypercube sampling, just to more evenly sample the parameter space. And then I ran the model 100 times. And again, this is to give us a ground truth for our training. So we have known parameter values and known model output. But then the next question is, of course, what is the model output that we want to predict? And this is, somewhat subjective to what we're interested in, but also based on the observations that we'll be able to bring in to use for the calibration. So what I'm showing here is an example of one of the outputs that we're trying to predict. And broadly, we want to be able to predict modes of variability of carbon and water fluxes. And so one example of this is to do empirical orthogonal functions on gross primary production, or GPP, which is essentially photosynthesis, so essentially carbon uptake. And the reason I'm using EOFs here is to do some dimensionality reduction such that each simulation is producing a single numerical estimate for this EOF, and I'm actually able to plot those in a histogram. So this histogram is showing the distribution from those 100 model simulations of this particular metric. And we want to do dimensionality reduction, but we also want to preserve some of the spatial variability. So that's why we sort of landed on EOFs as a good place to start. Now, before I talk more specifically about the training process and the architecture of the emulator, I thought I would take just a couple of slides to talk a little bit about pre-processing, since David John very nicely introduced the importance of that on the first day. And so I was going back through my notes for this project when I was first starting it, and there was a lot going on. I was starting my postdoc, I was learning Python at the same time, I was trying to figure out how to put all these pieces together. And so I found a piece of my notes where I was trying to sort of build a workflow for pre-processing for getting the climate model output ready for the machine learning emulator. So the details aren't important here, but just to sort of make the point that especially when you're going back and forth between different languages, which we've talked about a little bit in the questions, there were specific things that I knew that I had to do in Python, that I wanted to do in Python, namely the machine learning training, the algorithms. But there were also parts of the pre-processing that were easier for me to do in NCL, which is the NCAR command language, just because I was more used to that. I had existing code and I had workflows. So a lot of this is kind of, getting used to going back and forth between different languages, but it's all dependent on your own personal process. If I were starting this today, I might actually be able to do it all in Python and have a sort of much cleaner workflow, but that's just where I was starting from at the time. And then the other thing I'll say about pre-processing is that as I began to use Python more, I discovered there were lots of tools in the sort of Python toolkit to use. So I just listed a few of those here, if that's helpful, along with some code that I wrote to test different configurations of neural networks. So I was using Keras and TensorFlow for the machine learning components, along with sort of help from Python packages like NumPy and SciPy, Jupyter Notebooks as a sort of testing tool. But then the other thing is that this learning by doing takes time, and part of it for me was also just careful reading of the documentation. So for example, I found the Keras documentation to be really helpful when I was testing out architectures, different architectures for the neural network, and also just Google searching for code examples. So this is an example from Machine Learning Mastery, where they sort of tested out different learning rates, which is a hyperparameter, and I'll talk more about that in a few slides. So I found those to be helpful examples. Okay, so coming back to the training step, again, showing this outline of input neural network to output, but I've replaced some of the images with a bit more detail, a bit more quantitative nature on this slide. So again, just to remind you, the input that I'm using is essentially a table of values, which has 6 different parameters and 100 different simulations that I've used as my sort of training set. And this is fed into a 2-layer feed-forward artificial neural network. And again, the output here are the metrics I talked about from the land surface model. So I showed this image of the first EOF of GPP, but I'm just showing the first 3 because we trained to predict the first 3 EOFs. And the reason why we chose the first 3 were they accounted for over 95% of the variability. And I've updated the neural network image here just to really emphasize the dimensions. So the 6 dimensions of the input layer, the 6 different parameters, using those to predict the 3 different outputs here. And I should say, sort of as an aside, a separate emulator was built to predict the first 3 EOFs of latent heat flux, which is the evaporative flux. So different emulators were used to predict variability in GPP versus latent heat flux. Okay, so I've been seeing a lot of questions in the during the discussions about hyperparameters. And so I wanted to spend a little time talking very specifically about hyperparameter optimization, what I did for my work. And so again, this is not sort of setting the weights and biases of the network. That's set during the training process. But then there are all these other hyperparameters that are kind of set by the user. And so I've listed some here that I considered. I don't think this is an exhaustive list for artificial neural networks, but they were the primary ones that I considered. So I'm just going to go through somewhat briefly each of these, and there'll be going to be a lot of text on the next slide, but it'll be all there for your reference if you want to go back and look at these slides. Okay, so number of hidden layers. I've sort of already alluded to this, but I found that 2 layers improved the performance over a single hidden layer. I didn't want to go any deeper than that because I wanted to limit the number of so-called trainable parameters, so the weights and biases, just because my input data set size was limited. Similar number of nodes and neurons in each layer. What I did there was I iteratively tested between 5 and 15 in each, and so I sort of wrote this loop to test the predictive skill of each configuration, and then selected some of the best performing configurations based on an error metric, which I'll talk about in a few slides, and looking at the predictive skill. So activations has been mentioned a couple of times. This is the sort of linear or nonlinear functions that you're using in between the different layers. And I'm including this figure from David John, sort of plotting different activation functions, just as a reminder. And for me, I found that ReLU improved my performance when I used that as the first activation. And I also found that the hyperbolic tangent improved over sigmoid for the second activation. Optimization algorithm has also been mentioned. I believe Karthik showed this image in the lower right here during his talk, just to sort of compare these different optimization algorithms where you're searching for the best fit, you're searching for the minima. And what I found for my particular case is that an adaptive learning rate method called RMS prop improved the predictive skill over the traditional stochastic gradient descent. And so this image here is just showing how if you're in a saddle point and these different optimization algorithms are searching for a solution, some of them just happen to be faster than others getting out of this saddle point. And so I did indeed find that that was the case for my problem. But it's going to be very, problem specific or dependent based on the sort of system that you're looking at. Okay, so the next hyperparameter I want to talk about is the learning rate. And here I'm going to include a little bit more detail about how I tested different learning rates. And again, this came from that machine learning mastery code example, thinking about, okay, let's actually write some code where we go through and we test some configurations with different learning rates, and we plot those so-called learning curves. And so all the plots I'm showing here are looking at how the error term, which I'm using mean squared error between the predictions and the model output as my error metric, how that evolves over the training process. And so the x-axis is sort of the training steps, the epochs. And so if you compare these curves, what you can see is that I sort of settled on this compromise of a learning rate of 0.01 because it provided a good compromise between speed of convergence and accuracy. And really what you see is when you have a high learning rate, you might get fast convergence, but you might possibly lose some of that accuracy. And you can see that in these spikes. Whereas when you decrease the learning rate, it might be slower to converge, which means it could possibly get stuck in a local minima, but I found that there was sort of a nice trade-off as I sort of compared these different learning rates. Too low, and it was too slow. The other thing I'll just note here is that I've separated the data into a training and test set. We've talked about this, but that's to sort of make some, do some validation within the training process. I also want to talk about batch size. So I think this just came up in the questions during Jeb's talk. So the batch size is an important hyperparameter. It's the number of subsamples that you use to calculate the error gradient at each step. So again, I'm comparing different batch sizes and plotting learning curves for the training and test set. Now, I found for my purposes that a batch size of 20, again, was a good compromise between speed and accuracy. But if you're looking at these plots, you might be sort of saying, I can't really tell the difference between them. And part of that is because the error starts out relatively large, it decreases quickly, but the y-axis scale is kind of masking the difference between them. So on the next slide, I'm going to zoom in on sort of the last half of each of these curves to get rid of the problems of the y-axis scale. You'll also perhaps notice that the x-axis is not the same for these plots. And I'll also talk about why that is on the next slide. Okay, so again, same plots on the right here, but I've zoomed in on the last half of the training. And now you can really see the difference between the blue and the orange lines, and also perhaps get a sense of why batch size of 20 was a good choice. Really what we're looking for here in these learning curves is that the training error, so the blue curve, has decreased to a somewhat stable amount, while at the same time the test error, which is the orange curve, has also decreased and is close to the training error, but isn't sort of increasing again beyond the training error. And so the reason that the number of epochs is different for each of these is because I use something called early stopping to determine the number of epochs. And basically what you can do there is say, give it some criteria. So the criteria I used was once the test error starts to increase again, and you can sort of vary the amount of patience that you use with that. Does it stop it immediately as soon as it starts to increase, or does it allow for some buffer? But that allows the training process itself to kind of determine the number of epochs, and then that's one less hyperparameter that you have to sort of decide on yourself. So hopefully that was a helpful overview of hyperparameter optimization. There's a lot to talk about there, but that's sort of the basics of how I went about my process. Okay, so assessing the performance of the emulator, I haven't really shown a plot like this yet. You know, other than the learning curves and figuring out the training process, I also looked at plots where I was comparing the predictions versus the actual model output. Because again, this is supervised learning and we know the right answer. I'm also showing here how I've separated the data into 3 different sets: training, testing, and validation for different purposes. Again, to be able to have some validation within the training process and also have a completely separate set that's used for sort of out of sample prediction. And again, this is just one of the particular outputs that I was predicting with the emulator. And so what we want to see is sort of good one-to-one correspondence with this comparison, which we do see. And again, just to remind you how I went about assessing the performance of testing different architectures, I sort of iteratively tested different hyperparameters, selecting best performing configurations. But then step 2, which I haven't talked about yet, is for those best performing configurations, I did randomly resample the training data 100 times to test the variability of performance. So this is somewhat related to what Dora was talking about with the k-fold cross-validation. Basically, it's saying, you know, these orange points that are labeled the training data, we don't want to just depend on that same subset of data for our training. So what I did was I resampled that training data 100 times and then looked at how the performance varied when the configuration is fixed, but the training data is a separate subset. And so basically what I was looking for was networks that had high skill and low variability of performance. So that was sort of how I assessed the network configuration that I ended up using. Another way of testing the performance is to do additional out-of-sample prediction. So similar to the previous slide, here I'm just showing all of the points from the original ensemble. Again, the predictions versus the model output. This was sort of the results from the best emulator trained on those parameter values and corresponding model output. But what I did next was I took actually the same emulator, but I ran an additional 100-member ensemble, perturbed parameter ensemble with the land surface model with different parameter values. And then I ran those parameter values through this emulator. And I saw that the predictive skill was very comparable. And this was really a nice result that gave us a lot of confidence in the ability of the emulator to generalize to unseen data, because again, these were parameter values that were completely different from the ones used throughout the training process. However, that same emulator is able to produce pretty good skill. So now that we feel like we have a reasonable emulator that's producing pretty good predictive skill, we can go to step 2, which is emulation. And I'll just walk through an example of how that works here. And in this case, I'm now using 1,000 parameter sets because it's somewhat arbitrary how many we can use. This is so fast. We can run them through our trained emulator, and much faster than running the full model, we can produce predictions. So here I'm comparing in blue the original ensemble, and in orange are the predictions. And so you can see how we're both able to capture sort of the magnitude of this distribution, but also the shape. So that was a really good test for us. And I really want to emphasize the increase in computational efficiency, because that's why we're using machine learning in this context. The particular configuration of the land model that I was running took about 2 hours per simulation, which actually isn't that bad for running a climate model, because I was running at low resolution and it was the land only configuration. But still, using the emulator to test a new set of parameters takes seconds to generate these predictions. So that was really a key factor in doing this work. I also want to show a couple of slides on model interpretation. I think this is going to be discussed in more depth tomorrow, but I did try some different interpretation techniques for my work, and I think it's useful also to talk about interpretation in a regression context, since a lot of the interpretation examples are sometimes classification problems, but one that I found that worked particularly well for me was called variable or feature importance. And so what this is doing is it's randomly shuffling the values of one parameter. So it's kind of removing the skill from that parameter and testing the performance of the emulator. And again, the skill metric here is the mean squared error between the predictions and the actual values. And I'm going to be showing you some bar charts for GPP and latent heat flux. And the larger bars, they're going to be bars for each parameter. The larger bars means that parameter is more important to the predictive skill of the emulator, because when you remove the skill of it, the error goes up. So these are the results for doing variable feature importance on my emulator. And so what's really interesting here is that we can see right away for GPP, there's one parameter in particular that's responsible for a lot of the skill in the emulator, and we can talk about that more. And for latent heat flux, it's more of a mix. There's sort of different parameter that's the most important, and then there's more contributions from other parameters. Just sort of briefly mention what these parameters are, because I haven't been able to talk about that in too much detail. This parameter is related to plant hydraulics and water movement in the plants. And if you want to learn more about that, there's a nice paper here by Daniel Kennedy. And then this parameter is actually the one that I talked about at the beginning, the example that I gave of the stomatal conductance slope, and there's a reference for that here. So this is a nice result showing us which parameters are important to the predictive skill, but we also might want to know why those particular parameters are important. And that's where we can use a technique called partial dependence plots. And so this is really testing why a certain parameter is important and plotting where in its uncertainty range it's most important. And so the way that we calculate this is to fix values of each parameter one at a time and test the performance of the emulator across different ensemble members. And so what I'm going to be showing here are a bunch of line plots showing for GPP and latent heat flux the metric across parameter values. And so what you're looking for in each plot are regions of non-zero slope, and that indicates where in the parameter range the emulator is most sensitive. So right away, you can see that some parameters, for example, down on the lower right here, are not very sensitive across their uncertainty range. Let me also point out that the x-axes here all range between 0 and 1 because I've normalized the parameter ranges for their various units and their different scales. So they're all normalized to go between 0 and 1 between their minimum value and their maximum value. And so for certain parameters, there's not a lot of variation, but again, the Kmax parameter, which was very important for GPP on the previous slide, we can see from this that it's actually the low values of Kmax that are very important, where the emulator is most sensitive. Whereas for the slope parameter, which was important for latent heat flux, it's kind of got a more constant slope throughout its uncertainty range. So this is interesting because then we can sort of go back and think about the particular parameters and the particular biophysical processes that we're capturing with this emulator. Okay, so I've gone through training, I've gone through emulation. I think we're probably about 2/3 of the way through. And so at this point, I want to pause and see if there's any questions so far. And I'll try to restart at around noon, so I'll keep an eye on the time. Okay, so first question is from Ignacio. What made you choose a neural network as opposed to cheaper emulators such as Gaussian processes? Yeah, it's a good question. For this work, we haven't really tried different emulators or different algorithms. I know that Ben had looked at random forests and found that the emulation skill wasn't as good as artificial neural networks. So we were kind of starting from that point of having some previous work using artificial neural networks that worked pretty well. I will also say that in this context, the emulator is pretty cheap. So I didn't worry too much about that as a factor. But it's a good question. Next question is from Mike. This seems like one of those cases where getting physically plausible parameter sets seems vital. How did you constrain values in your emulated parameterizations? Okay, I think Perhaps this is asking about how I set the uncertainty ranges for the parameters before I did the sampling and before I ran the perturbed physics ensemble. And that's a great question. And again, I didn't talk at all about the parameter selection process, but that was based on a set of sensitivity tests. The uncertainty ranges themselves were based on searching through the literature and updating with different observational data sets. So for example, the data that I showed for the slope parameter was part of a larger data set that I used to set those uncertainty ranges. And for that particular parameter, we were actually able to set uncertainty ranges that varied across plant type, which is another sort of dimension of variability in a land surface model. So there were a lot of factors that went into setting those ranges. Question from Emma. Could you comment on the uncertainty of soil respiration within land surface models? Yeah, it's a great question. Not really a process that I'm looking at, since I'm focused more on the hydrology and the biophysical side, but it's definitely something that we think about a lot in biogeochemical modeling. And uncertainty in soil respiration and how that relates to temperature changes is really important factor for thinking about climate change predictions. So I agree, very important to keep thinking about that process. Okay, next question from Felix. Did you consider to use autoencoders for dimensionality reductions instead of EOFs to overcome the linearity? I don't know too much about autoencoders, so I'd love to chat more about that. Yeah, the EOFs is definitely an approximation, and I'll talk a little bit more in the next part of my talk about how, even though we're sort of using them to include some additional spatial variability and not just predict global mean values, we're still having trouble getting the regional responses to match up in the calibrated model. And so part of that just has to do with the choice of metrics. So it's definitely important to keep thinking about. Okay, I think I'll take one more question and then go back to my slides. So question from Mohan. In the land parameterization schemes of hydrological and meteorological models differ greatly. How could this be resolved in ML? Yeah, great question, really broad question. I think we'll hear more about parameterization schemes during the rest of the week. But I agree, and that's one reason for this work. We're focused on a specific land surface model so that at least we have eliminated the sort of structural variation of different models that I showed in the very beginning. But that's something where we could go next, is to sort of think about structural uncertainty and different process representations and sort of swapping those out and then being able to try and emulate those and test for that source of uncertainty. Okay, thanks for the questions so far. I think we'll go back to the talk just so we have enough time here. Okay, I think, am I still sharing or do I need to reshare? Okay.
Yeah, we see your screen. Okay.
Thanks, Karthik. And thanks for all the folks monitoring the questions. Thanks, Teja. Okay, so I've gone through steps 1 and 2. Now we're going to talk about the next 2 steps of the process. And I don't have as many slides on this, so hopefully this will go a bit more quickly. So calibration. Here's where we get to actually bring in observations to try and pick the best fit parameter values. So I'm just sort of orienting you, showing these distributions. Again, this is all from the perturbed parameter ensemble from the model output, but I've added 2 lines to these distributions to just show you both where the model sits with default values, so if you don't change any parameter values, and also where the observations are. So I've put the observations in this EOF space. And so the question is then, now I'm overlaying the predictions in orange on top of these distributions. The question is, can we optimize the predictions so that the emulator gives us the best fit parameter values to these observations? And it's not as simple as sort of just picking out the parameter set in the orange distribution that's closest to this red line, because we've actually got several different metrics that we're trying to constrain at the same time. We've got multiple modes of variability of GPP and latent heat flux. But we can do this. We can construct an optimization that's sort of asking the question of pulling out this best fit parameter set. And when we do that, we get the results of this blue dashed line. And again, this is looking pretty good, at least for these first modes of GPP and latent heat flux, because the emulator is saying, okay, here's the parameter set that I think is the best match to observations. And indeed, it's very close to the red line in both cases. And again, here we're really using the speed and the efficiency of the emulator to sample the parameter space very quickly. You know, we can do this thousands of times, tens of thousands of times, and be able to really harness that increased computational efficiency. But we can also take this a step further, which is to do the test step. And that's to say, okay, this blue line is where the emulator thinks the optimized prediction should be. But let's actually take that parameter set and run it back through the full land surface model and see if that also matches up pretty well. And so now I've added a green line to these plots, and that's the result of the test case with the best fit parameter values. And we can see for both of these metrics that the lines are very close to each other, which is great. We're able to test both the emulator performance, so how well the blue and the green lines match up, but also test the optimized predictions. So comparing the blue and green lines to the red line, are they getting close to the observations? But I sort of alluded to this before. We don't just have 2 targets that we're trying to match, we actually have 6. And so that's part of the challenge of this optimization problem, and constructing a cost function for this optimization is how to simultaneously pick a parameter set that matches well for all of these 6 targets. And you can probably see from the other panels that we're not doing as well for the higher modes. And so we're still sort of thinking about why that might be the case, and how we can sort of construct a cost function to do this optimization. And then the last thing I want to say about testing is that I've been showing you these sort of one-dimensional spaces here, where I've reduced the dimensionality into these EOFs. But because we have this test set, this green line, that's the full land surface model, we can actually look at how these responses, how these models compare spatially. So that's what I'm showing here. So let's start with the column on the right. The top is GPP, the bottom is latent heat flux. And so this is the default model with no changes in parameter values relative to the observations. So this is sort of our starting point. We know that the model is biased for this particular metric, for this particular observational data set, for a variety of reasons. I mean, it's really difficult to calibrate global land surface models. And so again, the question was, can we do better with the neural network optimized parameter values? And in the one-dimensional case, we saw that we had a lot of improvement. Now, if you compare that spatially, so here's comparing the optimized model, that green line, with the observations, you can see that there are some places where we're able to decrease the biases, like in the Sahel and parts of the Congo and Africa. But then there are also places where biases increase, for example, in the Amazon. And then there's slightly different responses for latent heat flux. So we're still trying to figure out why this is. There's a couple of reasons that I've listed here. There's definitely additional sources of uncertainty that we haven't considered. For example, forcing observations, structural biases. I'm only using 6 parameters here. So there's a lot of other sources of uncertainty to think about. This is also very dependent on the choice of the output variables. So again, I'm just looking at modes of variability of GPP and latent heat flux. And some of that is because we're somewhat limited by the global observational products we can use. But that's definitely going to impact the results. And then lastly, I think very importantly, the choice of the metrics. So the EOF calculation decomposition was done on annual mean spatial variability. And this is important because, especially for quantities like GPP and latent heat flux, the seasonal cycle is really important. And so we're not capturing any of that here, but it would be great to go back. We've already talked about repeating this with different metrics to better capture the seasonal cycle and see if we can reduce some of the uncertainty there. Okay, I just have a few slides before I wrap up, just to sort of bring it back to the beginning and talk a little bit about future work. You know, we can go beyond just having a best fit parameter set. We can actually generate parameter posterior distributions using Bayesian inference. And so I'm showing an example of that here, where these are best estimates for parameter values to match observations, but not just a single set of parameter values, distributions. And then the idea there is that we would feed those into a different neural network that's been trained to emulate the future climate response of a land surface model. And this is just very preliminary work, but sort of showing you the predicted change in GPP and global mean GPP, accounting for parameter uncertainty. So comparing the full parameter space in blue with the constrained predictions based on these posterior distributions. So this could be one way of sort of putting these results in the context of climate predictions. And then finally, I just want to bring it back to the beginning, because I think it's really important to continue to better understand and also communicate these uncertainties that we have in modeling, and not just in climate modeling. I mean, we've shown that we can use machine learning to think about uncertainty in climate model predictions, but I was sort of thinking about model uncertainty more broadly, and I think this is really important for the current coronavirus pandemic. So I found a COVID-19 simulator from Mass General Hospital, and what I found really interesting about this is that you could sort of play with different settings in terms of how open your state is. This is just for Colorado, but they were producing sort of estimates of active cases, but they were also producing some uncertainty on that. And I think that's going to continue to be really important, thinking about how we communicate uncertainties in modeling going forward. Okay, so to summarize, parameter choices are really important to understanding uncertainty in these climate and land model predictions. I've shown that neural network emulators can be trained to reproduce the output of a land surface model with much greater computational efficiency. And then we've been able to optimize these predictions to minimize error between the model and observations. And in closing, I'll just say that I think machine learning can help us to understand and communicate uncertainty in modeling climate predictions and possibly other systems. So thanks very much for your time. I'd be happy to take more questions. And then this is just the reference to paper and review, and also acknowledging my co-authors on this work. So thanks very much. Okay, so it looks like I have about 10 minutes for questions, which is great. So first question from AZ. Can you elaborate what emulators are, how they work, why use them? Yeah, I think it's a pretty broad question. For my case specifically, I wanted to be able to emulate the performance or the output of a land surface model. And the reason that we're using that is so that we can have much greater computational efficiency and speed in the predictions. Because when you're doing something like parameter calibration, you want to be able to test thousands of different parameter sets, and you don't want to have to run the full model thousands of times. So that's really why we're using them in this context. Okay, next question from Emma. Is there a particular reason to use Python instead of R? Yeah, it's a good question. I found that, well, again, this is a very personal choice, but I was trying to learn Python at the same time. So I found that this was a good way of sort of going through and sort of forcing myself to learn it better. I also found a lot of code examples in Python and documentation that that was helpful to me. So that was my particular reason, but I think we've already discussed that it's definitely possible to do these things in R as well. Okay, next question from A. Cheng. Epoch step iteration, what's the difference? Can we optimize hyperparameters concurrently with weights and biases? Yeah, that's probably true. And this is sort of showing how much I have to learn in this area. I think David Hall alluded to some automated hyperparameter optimization. Perhaps others can speak more to this, But I think that would be great if we can make this process more automated and more streamlined. In terms of the first part of the question, yeah, I was probably using those terms interchangeably, but in general, an epoch is defined as a step in the training process where you're actually passing through all of the data and then updating your network weights and biases based on the back propagation. Okay, next question from Chris. How do you choose the number of layers in your net? Again, this is going to be very problem specific. I found that 2 hidden layers improved over a single hidden layer for my purposes. I didn't want to go deeper or more complex than that just because I didn't want to have too many free parameters, as in the weights and the biases of the network, because those are going to increase as you increase both the number of layers and the number of nodes in each layer. So because I had sort of a limited training data set, I didn't want to go beyond 2 hidden layers. Okay, question from Luke. In the constraining step, are you providing sparse/local observations or global land model outputs? So both global observations and global land model outputs. So the particular optimization is running across the EOF space. So those histograms that I showed comparing the observations in red and the emulator predictions in blue, that's based on EOF space, but the observations are global and they've been translated into the EOF space. And so that plot that I showed at the end with the spatial variability was showing, you know, globally where we have the observations and also the output of the model. Okay, next question is from Josh. When the neural net outputs an EOF, is it outputting the coefficient of a predetermined EOF or the whole EOF structure as a vector? Yes, good question. It's outputting the coefficient. I had to remind myself. But yeah, the singular value decomposition produces sort of 3 different parts. But the particular part that I was getting it to, I wanted it to predict was variability sort of decomposed across space. And then I could show those histograms where each point on the histogram was a particular ensemble member. Okay, question from Krishna. How do we decide numbers of simulations? Great question. I think that more is better. And I started with an 100-member ensemble just for sort of feasibility and computational efficiency. But yeah, more is definitely better. And the more training data that you have, the better. So that's, yeah, I guess it's somewhat dependent on your problem and how easily available the data is or how readily available running these simulations, how computationally intensive it is. Okay. Okay, so next question is from Fitria. How is your method to test each hyperparameter one by one, or you construct some configuration of hyperparameter combinations? Kind of both. And again, this is something that I think if I do this again, I might do it differently. But what I found was helpful was to start by testing each hyperparameter one by one. I guess testing different neural network configurations. Like I said, I built a loop to go, once I decided on 2 hidden layers, I built a loop to go over the number of nodes in each of those layers, and then selected some of the best performing configurations. And then on those configurations, I tested different learning rates, different batch sizes. And so that was some of the results I was showing. I think it could be done in a lot of different ways. And I think it could definitely be improved on in terms of the automation and also just making sure you're efficiently sampling the space. But there's a lot to consider. So I had to kind of prioritize the hyperparameters that I wanted to spend the most time on. I think you could spend a lot of time on this, and sometimes you kind of need to move to the next step once you have a reasonably well-performing network. Yes, so question from David, when testing different hyperparameters, do you lock in one at a time? Yeah, so I think I just answered that. I started with layers, and then I went to nodes, and then I tested different batch sizes, activation functions, sort of one at a time, but they all influence each other. So again, I think this could be done in a more space-filling way, but I found that one at a time for me was the best way to keep track. Okay, next question's from Ragu330. Would an LSMT be better than FFN, as they can store, memorize the soil moisture or temperature better, so latent heat flux could be better predicted? I'm not sure I know those acronyms, so I might need some clarification. So they can store, memorize the soil moisture or temperature better. Yeah, I mean, I think in general, the question is asking about the emulation itself. And I think that definitely could be approached from a lot of different perspectives. And again, yeah, we want to keep in mind the fact that we're trying to predict carbon and water fluxes. So keeping those physics in mind and really choosing architectures and algorithms based on those physics is in general a good thing to do. So, so I can't be more specific, but I'm happy to follow up. Okay, comment from Jakir. Thanks for the comment. Do we still, yeah, we still have a couple minutes left. Question from Sem. Partial dependence plots showed high uncertainty in the response some variables. Shouldn't you drop them if they do not seem to add info? Yeah, it's a good question. Haven't tried this, but would be interesting to retrain with a different set of parameters. I also think that what's happening now is we're sort of going through and thinking about how to better constrain the uncertainty ranges of some of those parameters. So I think what might happen next is if we tried this with different uncertainty ranges, we wouldn't see such a dominant response from a few parameters, and then we'd actually be able to see some of the other parameters popping out potentially as more skillful. So both approaches I think are useful, dropping out some parameters or constraining the ranges. Okay, question from A. Cheng. Do you hold the rest of hyperparameters constant when generating the learning rate curves, or do you allow them to change as well? Okay, I think, yeah, I think this is related to the question before. Holding the rest of them constant while generating the learning curves is what I did. Question from Deborah. Thanks for that. How does the time spent on the emulator plus computer time compare to just running CLM? Yeah, so my comparison that I showed was just the amount of time to run a single model ensemble member, which is a couple of hours with CLM, but that's very dependent on the configuration and the model resolution and the complexity, whereas the emulator took seconds in the prediction. But I think maybe this question is also asking about the time spent training, which I didn't quantify, but took a long time and is an important thing to think about. Again, when you're going through this process, it could be a lot of work up front, the pre-processing, the training, the hyperparameter optimization. But then, you know, that is a big time saving if we're able to then use these emulators to test potentially tens of thousands of parameter sets very quickly, you know, in a matter of minutes. And so that's really powerful. But I agree, it's important to think about sort of the upfront time as well. Karthik, should I keep going?
Yeah, we can go on for another minute and then we can conclude. Thank you. Okay,
yeah, just let me know. Question from QG, could you please elaborate the detailed process, how you find the optimized parameters? So I guess I'm not sure if this is referring to hyperparameters, which I sort of discussed in answers to some of the other questions, or the optimized model parameters. So I'll talk about that maybe for a minute, because I haven't talked about that as much. And yeah, again, here's where building a cost function becomes really important. And the cost function has to take into account the balance between the emulator predictions for 6 different targets, 3 modes of variability for 2 output variables, and the observational targets for those. So yeah, I've tried a lot of different iterations of the cost function based on, you know, what metrics to use, sort of do a comparison between the model prediction, the emulator predictions and observations. But I agree that's going to be a really important part of the calibration itself, and it's going to impact the performance of how well we're able to calibrate the model is how we define the cost function. So that could be a whole other talk in itself, I think.
All right, thank you very much, Katie. That was a really insightful talk with lots of details and practical tips. And thank you all for joining today's sessions. I do have a few comments before we take a break. First of all, I'd like to thank all the speakers for the day. Really great talks and lots of great suggestions on how to get started with applying machine learning and deep learning to the problems that they're facing in their research. We do have a 30-minute panel discussion when we come back after lunch, or at least lunch here in the US and probably dinner elsewhere. For the panel discussion, we've had some really great questions come up in the last 2 days, but I did want to refocus and make a few suggestions on how you could maximize the output of these panel discussions. We have some really stellar speakers today and tomorrow and Friday, and they're all experts in the fields in which they're working in. They've had a lot of experience in applying machine learning and deep learning to various different problems. So I'd encourage you to think hard and deep about your questions for these panelists in the break, so you can maximize your output from these discussions. Some general guidelines would be, if you could pose broad questions, they tend to be more relevant for the audience. I must say that we were amazed to know that we had about 2,400 people on the first day, which is way over what we were expecting. We were expecting about 1,000, which itself is huge, but it was amazing to know that there's 2,400 people on this right now. We'll find out what the stats are for the rest of the week. But so if you can have your questions be fairly broad so that they encompass various different aspects of the earth sciences, that would be excellent. Please try to be clear about your question. So if you want to elaborate, that's helpful to clarify exactly what you mean. Otherwise, we sort of have to guess what you're trying to say. And finally, obviously, try to be specific to the speakers of the day. Of course, the speakers cover a wide range of topics, so you have a lot of options. For example, today, there was a lot on uncertainty quantification and sort of practical applications in forecasting and so on. So we'll pause there for about 55 minutes, and we'll be back for the panel discussion at 1:20 p.m. Mountain Time. Thank you.